I'll be going through the topics that Juliana had also put in her blog post that I believe she'd shared out before the seminar, or along with the link. And those were some of the questions that we went over in a back and forth conversation we had over email over a few months. And the first question Juliana had asked is, how does my background lead me to my current work? And what is this hierarchy that I'm talking about? As previously shown, I have a background going across a lot of disciplines. And I started moving more from the humanities and social sciences to computer science because I had this background in history of science, science and technology studies, and I was really dissatisfied with the state of discourse that I saw around. Back then it was big data. As I learned more, I think machine learning is the more important thing to think about. But of course, it takes place under lots of labels: artificial intelligence, deep learning, and all of these are related, or data science. And so I went into computer science trying to get more of the background to engage on a more granular level with some of the material critically, and work both externally and internally. And so I would say what the paper that will be the topic of this talk is really about is, does modeling really work? And as I'll discuss shortly, machine learning really is just another type of modeling, almost identical to statistical modeling, but for very different purposes and with a different style. And the answer is, as with many things in social science, maybe, sometimes, if it's done right and we get lucky. Often we don't even have the ability to tell whether it worked or not. And that also makes it challenging. And I'll be breaking down some of the claims that happen around machine learning and interrogate them critically and show how both internally and externally they are probably exaggerated for the most part, especially when they're made in press releases, made by businesses selling products. But even academic papers, I think, don't do a very good job of understanding the limitations and framing things in a responsible way. The plot that Juliana had in her blog post comes from my paper, and it's this sort of tree of methodological approaches. And this is the structure of my paper, and I go down different branches of this and say, what are the trade-offs? Why do some people advocate going down this branch versus that branch? And I don't have the depth to know, what are other branches, other types of these things. And under simulation, I know there's agent-based modeling, and then there's system dynamics, equations, there's partial differential equations and other types. So you can choose different approaches to modeling things even within these. Qualitative, certainly there's many different approaches. Content analysis or grounded theory from ethnography that I, again, don't have a very good grasp of the range of. So I left those as dotted lines. Where this came about, and maybe it'll explain more of what I'm trying to do with this, is seeing a lot of literature about these binaries. Juliana shared with me some of the research she had done in the 2000s looking into the paradigm wars. And this is something I hadn't even heard about, but I do know some of the products of it. These methodological syntheses or attempts to say, how do we combine quantitative research and qualitative research? This work is, Juliana tells me, at the end of the paradigm wars, and this is from 1988. And this tries to say, what is quantitative research good for? What is qualitative research good for? How do you do either of them properly? And how do you combine them? And these are debates that still go on today, but are completely unknown within the majority of computer science and machine learning literature that I read. So I do want to bring that in. But this is one branch. And I think a lot of us, I haven't studied this in great depth, have a sense that experiments versus observation is another big debate in the quantitative literature, especially in psychology, econometrics, economics more generally, that can you say anything without experiments, without manipulating the world? That's on the one hand where people take causality to be, by definition, manipulation or intervention, and causality being what really matters. On the other hand, people saying a lab experiment in psychology has no ecological validity. The way people perform and behave in these very artificial settings doesn't generalize at all. You've made a conclusion that doesn't apply in any way to what happens in society in the world. So that's the flip side of observation and experimentation. A good review of all of these is in a collected volume from 2014. That's specifically about field experiments, but it goes into that division. But I think a big breakthrough came when I came across this article from 2010 by Galachmelli. She says there is a difference between explanation and prediction, and the failure to understand this difference is a major pedagogical failing of statistics and also a major misunderstanding around machine learning. And specifically at the end of the article, she gives a mathematical example of how a model that predicts well, as prediction is defined in statistics and machine learning, can actually not capture the causal process. So in some sense, a false model, one that reflects this toy model worse, can do better at this task of prediction. And even though that is, a very artificial example, put in mathematical terms, just decoupling this idea of whatever predicts will explain was really helpful for me to think about the difference between the methodologies that are often approached in statistics versus what machine learning is trying to do. And since, I think 2000, 2001, there's been a lot written about how machine learning is converging with statistics, how early machine learning was a set of more ad hoc methods, but gradually it was put onto a statistical footing using things like probability theory, concentration of measure, estimation theory, and all these other things from statistics. It's diverged a little bit around deep learning, but the basic idea is you use data to reverse engineer some underlying function or boundary or thing that you imagine exists in the world. Whether you do that for the purpose of explaining things, for understanding, or merely making predictions is the major difference between what statistics and machine learning try to do. Of course, either can do either task and they do them slightly differently, but that's the big difference between them, even though they both will use linear regression or logistic regression as kind of the first thing they will try. Exact same mathematics, exact same software implementations, and a lot of the same data sets as well, but a difference in the style and output. So some other things that I'd come across that help me construct this hierarchy. Simulation is compared, and specifically agent-based simulation is compared as an alternative to statistical modeling. So if you have data, you probably are not going to be very well served by simulation because it's hard to put those data into a simulation. You can just initialize and then compare outputs, but it's difficult to use it directly. Versus if you can't manipulate a system, whether for ethical or logistical reasons, maybe statistics is not going to give you what you really care about. And so simulation advocates say that simulation will give you the causality that you might care about. Or in epidemiology, and I've renamed this category, I first called it mathematical modeling, but then I found out in epidemiology, they distinguish data modeling from mechanistic modeling. And mechanistic modeling, I think it's gotten more attention under COVID-19. Things like the SIR model, susceptible, infected, recovered, or removed. These are sets of differential equations that are difficult to fit to data, but give a conceptual understanding and allow for arguments about the dynamics and how epidemics work. And that's not to say that they can't be compared, but the primary value of these equations and these derivations is not to fit to data or to explain the shapes we see in data, but rather as a set of first principles to understand what we might expect to see in data or how we might try to manipulate the world to change the data that we end up seeing. And so I've renamed this mechanistic after epidemiology. That gives this big branching tree. And implicitly, when we choose a discipline, when we choose a methodology, we are on some branch of this tree. And we've implicitly made a set of decisions, whether that's in a particular project or even in our training, about what we've prioritized, what we can do and what we cannot do. And each of these has trade-offs. I talked about some of them between, for example, simulation or equations and using data or modeling data. And earlier, I think we can maybe get into a discussion later on. There were these, really acrimonious debates about quantitative versus qualitative inquiry and research. And I, again, found this article that really helped me make this link between machine learning and statistics as kind of a branch in this tree. I would say mainstream machine learning is about following this sequence of branches. And I would define it as a kind of working realist definition as extrapolating from correlations to anticipate outputs of a static system. I would say that the learning in machine learning is completely a metaphor now. Maybe early on it attempted to capture some processes of learning, but it bears very little resemblance to even in cognitive learning theory and almost no resemblance to sociocultural learning theory, for example. So it's purely a metaphor for improving with more input. And it's really about using correlations. And as I talk more about in my paper, and as a lot of social science literature talks about, correlations use the mean, the average, some sort of central tendency. And that privileges the mass at the expense of outliers or people who don't fit into whatever is average. And that can have powerful normative consequences as well. And so machine learning is building on the same set of machinery that you've committed to up here when going with probability-based modeling. And lastly, I'll get more into this later as well, but it doesn't really anticipate the ways in which a system could change. If there is variability that has been observed in the system already, machine learning might be able to account for that, but it fails miserably when something completely new appears in the system. So it's very much reactive. It's not making these larger connections that statistics tries to do in terms of finding causal relationships that can be then generalized to unseen systems. And certainly imagining entirely different ways of thinking, of knowing, of being, of doing that will be further in these branches. And even inquiry is a choice of branch. You don't need to approach the world through inquiry. It can be through speculation, through practice, through a whole bunch of things. So even this is a branch of an even larger tree. The next thing that, actually I will pull up the questions, Juliana had asked about, is things about responsibility for quantification and what are some of the drawbacks of quantification. And these are, again, things that were well known in the paradigm wars, from what I have gathered and understood from some of the literature that's trickled down from that. And of course, a lot of this science and technology studies, history of science has contributed to. And this is the idea that quantification is privileging one set of meanings over all others. Theo Porter, in a wonderful 2012 piece, talks about thin and thick description. Thick description is, of course, an anthropological idea, but he contrasts this to post-World War II behavioralists who took thinning out meaning to only be what is observable, only what we can directly see, being the only thing that matters, as kind of the price worth paying. The sacrifice of human meaning was a price worth paying for these objective results or a proper objective methodology. And of course, solidifying one set of meanings indeed does let you get solid results on which you can build. But the problem is that you contribute to using one set of meanings over every other possibility, and then you forget or you lock that in, and you can't go back. And nothing in quantification can ever undo that. Exploratory data analysis, maybe you find some discrepancies in the data. At most, you can go back to the quantification process and understand what happened in it, but quantification itself can never fundamentally reverse that process of quantification of choosing one set of meanings over any other. And I'll go into some examples of this later. Another problem, and this I think directly contributed to some of those paradigm wars literature, is the difference between what is measurable, what is observable, and what we actually care about. And there's a version of a law called Goodhart's Law or Campbell's Law from 1975. They were published about the same time. And this is, different versions of it are, if you optimize to a measure, that measure will become bad or will no longer measure what it was originally measuring. Any statistical regularity that is used or put pressure on will cease to be useful. And what it's really talking about is this gap between the thing we care about in social science and psychometrics, we call this the underlying construct, and what is operationalized, what we're actually able to observe and measure. And some examples of this, a recent paper that got a lot of attention, justifiably so, by Obermeyer et al., talked about how a healthcare system was discriminating against Black patients because it was optimizing to healthcare costs, which were measurable rather than the actual target of health. And because historically less money has been spent on Black patients because of systematic discrimination and racism, the system was just using those same patterns and optimizing along the same patterns. In education, I think we all know that grades are a poor proxy for ultimately what we care about, which is learning or maybe preparedness for whatever that might be. And learning is infinitely multifaceted and subjective and contingent. And crystallizing it into one set of meanings, which are how well you can do on some standardized assessment or some standardized grading of essays, is a pretty poor proxy. Maybe there's no better proxy or anything that can be measured, but when we do commit to quantification and measurement, that's the sacrifice we make for being able to get grades for millions of students, to be able to aggregate those, to be able to look at trends across time and space. Citations. In academia, we are judged by our H-index or our impact, what journals we publish in and their impact factor. Ultimately, those are based on things like citations, which are a poor way, I think we all understand, of assessing impact. Some things that are heavily cited have no impact. Some things that are never cited have extremely high influence, or they change people's perception of the world, of theory, of methodology. And those aren't things that can be easily quantified. What can be quantified, citations, is what ends up being used. And lastly, both arrests and convictions are a poor proxy for some underlying construct that we might imagine of crime. Juliana asked me for examples of bad measurement in machine learning. And I think there's some examples of bad measurement and also just some examples of assuming that what is available is what we care about, assuming that grades are learning or that citations are impact. There was a press release, this was earlier this year, and I think March or April, from Harrisburg University in Pennsylvania, that breathlessly proclaimed that a forthcoming paper can predict criminality with no racial bias. There was a group of scholars under the Coalition for Critical Technology who wrote a letter to Springer saying, on the face of it, this is implausible, if not impossible, and it makes category errors. One of the biggest things is that there's no such thing as criminality, let alone one that can be, predicted automatically. Criminality is based on what people decide is criminal or not. So for example, in the United States, an example I've seen is that wage theft, employers not paying their employees, is not actually criminalized, or it's not enforced, and people can get away with that very easily, versus things like loitering. Somebody just decided that that is criminal. Loitering is when you are just in a place or wait outside a place and are not doing anything specific. That is criminalized, and other behaviors are criminalized. But even given a given set of codes or a given set of laws, we never actually have statistics about crime. What we have are the proxies of arrests and convictions. In the US, we're certainly seeing the unavoidability of how these are really, really biased measures. Black people, Latinx people and other minorities are arrested at far, far, far higher rates. Similarly, convictions, people who even just have darker skin are given longer and more severe convictions for similar crimes. And certainly, I'm using the quantitative evidence here, but the more important thing is just people's experience of being brutalized, of being profiled, leads to the system of criminalization and criminality. And that's not something that is captured in faces. And to think so, the letter talks about physiognomy and these old practices of measuring skulls around eugenics. And it's a version of that there is no causal connection between this thing that they want to measure, criminality, and what is measurable in another way, faces. And yet they find a correlation and they assume that's because there's a direct link, rather than examining the entire matrix of things that are happening. And this paper wasn't actually ever published. It was withdrawn before we saw it. And then, I signed on to the letter. But I think it's in itself unremarkable, but this is the kind of assumptions and measurements that happen in machine learning, or the use of proxies without realizing that they are proxies. And that's a major danger. And this, I think, is a case that could be very harmful going forward. And so that's why it was important to intervene. But this is not the first study to do this. This won't be the last study to do this, both in this domain and many, many others. And so that's the kind of problem of measurement. One important thing, like I've been talking about, is that machine learning is matching whatever is measurable and not the underlying meanings. And an example I like to use is around image recognition and deep neural networks, which are some of the most impressive things to come out of machine learning. There, what these systems do is correlate patterns in pixels. And what's amazing is that they can automatically extract different patterns that correlate to human-given labels. And so that's the kind of connection they make. But in social science, we would say there's an underlying construct of catness that both produces humans labeling these pictures as those of cats and seeing certain patterns of pixels. But of course, catness is not one thing. In order to make human labels, we have to decide what counts as a cat for this purpose and what doesn't. And I give the example, is this a cat or not? Well, somebody on Mechanical Turk might immediately click, yes, it's a cat. Sure, it looks like a cat. But if we cared about phylogenetics and kind of evolutionary biology, then this is a false saber-toothed tiger, which is a marsupial and not at all related to felines or that order. Conversely, we would say, well, does this picture contain catness? And again, if somebody on Mechanical Turk was clicking through it, they would say no. But if we care about, is there something of this genetic lineage in the picture? Well, there is this cat disguised in the picture. And so we would say, yes, there is a cat. And so we need to decide what we care about capturing in catness. And there's no one thing that we can do for that. We have to decide on that. And if we ignore that, then we'll get edge cases, we'll get outliers that will be misclassified, that will be labeled as a cat or not a cat in ways that may be detrimental. And again, this is probably a harmless example, but it's showing the kind of importance of considering what the underlying construct is and not just focusing on the admittedly amazing performance of having billions of images that can be labeled as having cats or not having cats, such as using Google image search. I won't go too much into the things that have come out of disciplines like psychometrics about how you create measures and how you validate them. But there's construct validity, there's face validity, criterion related validity, internal and external validity, all of which are by and large unknown in machine learning. And some other papers, in addition to mine, are trying to bring this into machine learning. But machine learning is really only looking at external validity and ignoring all of these other things. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's good enough to ignore everything else. But other times when we want to make claims about the world, external validity alone is not good enough. We can achieve external validity while failing at all these other things. So those are some examples of measurement and how it matters. Another thing that I go into a little bit in my paper is this idea. Performativity, of course, is much older, and Judith Butler has also written about this. But in science and technology studies, Don McKenzie and others wrote this book, Do Economists Make Markets? Not do, markets exist and then economists study them. And specifically, Kieran Healy has a very good summary of this, is that the Performity Thesis is that economics produces a body of formal models and transposable techniques that, when carried out into the world, reorganizes the phenomena that the models purport to describe. And one way of understanding this is that whether or not the models were true before or not, when people start using them to think about the world and approach the world, they in effect become true, or they make themselves true. And this is hard to find very clear-cut, precise examples of, but in a more conceptual sense, if we look at models being sort of self-fulfilling prophecies, we can see examples where this might be happening. One example that I have in a work of mine is around Facebook's People You May Know recommendation system. That assumes that triadic closure exists. And this was also the example Kieran Healy gave that my paper goes into more quantitative detail about. This model assumes that friends of friends know each other. In social network analysis, we call this triadic closure or transitivity. And it built the system based on that. If you are a Facebook user, you'll see People You May Know, you have 38 friends in common. You have 115 friends in common. What happened when the system was introduced in Facebook is, lo and behold, the connections people were making were friend of a friend connections. Was this really using the underlying principle of triadic closure, which kind of existed in a latent sense in Facebook? Or did it just give people an easy button to click, producing the behavior that Facebook assumed it was using or seeing? And so the manipulation of systems with models, with these machine learning implementations of models that we usually call algorithms, are these changing the world in a way that would affect what we think is happening? And again, that's very subtle and something I struggle to apply, but it's a very important insight to think about this framing, about how are models affecting the world rather than just reflecting the world. Another major theme, and I'm working on a standalone piece about this as well, is the problem of this word prediction. And I love this quote from Daniel Gaio-Avello. He's talking about predicting election results with Twitter in 2012. He says, these predictions are not predictions at all. I have not found a single paper predicting a future result. All of them claim that a prediction could have been made, i.e. they are post hoc analysis, and needless to say, negative results are hard to find. There's a couple of things packed into this quote. One is a critique of publication bias, that negative results don't get published, which applies to machine learning as much as anything else. The other thing is that prediction in statistics, going back, I found cases maybe even as far back as Carl Pearson in the 20s and 30s, is used as a synonym for correlation. And this makes a certain kind of sense, that the best way to extrapolate, to look at the future, is to use correlations that you've seen in the past. But the way it's used, certainly now across statistics and machine learning, gives the impression that there's something much more profound going on than what actually is going on. People will proclaim that they have predicted elections with Twitter, when in fact they say, looking retrospectively, I was able to get a result that correlates two things. Do these generalize to the future? We don't know. And we have strong reasons to believe that no, they will not. And so I would also encourage that paper. This version is on arXiv, has a snarkier title. There's also a published version in an IEEE magazine. And as a way of explaining that more carefully, there's this great example from the New England Journal of Medicine that it's a joke paper. It says chocolate consumption leads to winning Nobel Prizes. And indeed, if you look at a plot, the more chocolate consumption a country has, the more Nobel laureates it has per population. In this article, Messerly jokes that, writes that there's proteins in chocolate that stimulate brain function. So obviously, if countries want to win more Nobel Prizes, they need to purchase mass quantities of chocolate and feed them to their people. And the joke, of course, was that correlation is not causation, and that we can invent plausible causal stories to explain correlations that can be completely inverse. But the important thing here is that machine learning will use correlations like this to make predictions. It will make retrodictions. It will make just descriptive statements about, and statistics does this too. This is not unique to machine learning. Descriptive statements about a correlation and simply call that a prediction. And say, I predict that Switzerland will have, if we extrapolated from this a linear trend, based on the chocolate consumption, we would predict that Switzerland would be up here. We're pretending that it was held out from the sample or truly out of sample, when in fact, we just do that for retrospective illustration purposes. And I can get more into cross-validation and how validation works in machine learning. But the idea is that you can fit different models again and again and again until you get good results. Or you can have papers that are people try to write again and again and again until you get good results. Prediction, which is correlation, is not explanation, which is causation. So a graphical model, and this is something that comes out of machine learning, but is very seldom used for actually, modeling causality, is something like national resources leads to both science funding and chocolate consumption. That leads, the science funding is what leads to Nobel Prizes. And so we observe a correlation going backwards through this tree between these two things, but we can't actually intervene on chocolate consumption and expect to wind up increasing Nobel Prizes. In more simple terms, we can ask, where does this correlation break down? Do past patterns fail? For example, the small European countries that have been very successful in the past, how are they going to compare against other places now, India, China, Brazil, Russia, which are not on this plot? This is all based on the history of Nobel Prizes, which maybe doesn't look like the future. We can also say Nobel Prizes supposedly are awarded on an underlying construct of merit. Who decides that? How is that measured? And that's also a very subjective process that we can easily imagine bias in. We certainly know about the bias against women that has existed in Nobel Prizes, and what other biases still exist in terms of country, background, race, and other personal characteristics. I also want to point out that this is not an obvious use of the word predict. There's this great philosophy book from 1998 called Predicting the Future. It points out that trend projection and curve fitting are reasonable ways of making predictions, but they're rather rudimentary. And Rescher is trying to say that things like scientific laws or analogies are much more robust and sophisticated and scientific ways of making predictions. And I think what people tend to not realize, and within machine learning, and certainly when hearing about machine learning results, is that the predictions of machine learning are extrapolations based on projecting forward, based on curve fitting. And there are critics within machine learning as well who are very strongly against curve fitting. But that's what the vast majority of machine learning does. It takes some set of data and it fits a curve to it or a decision boundary or something. Does that generalize? Maybe, maybe not. If the world changes, probably not. A good example of this is Google flu trends. And here, cross-validation was done properly, holding out data as a way of testing the model. And as you introduce more data to the model, indeed, it does very well at keeping up at the trends. So what this was, Google flu trends, using Google search data to try to beat the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's numbers about incidence of the flu in the United States. Doctors have to manually compile reports of how many flu patients they see and then send them to the US government centrally. And so Google was trying to use the search terms people use to do this process much faster and to get projections of the flu incidence before the CDC can compile the official numbers laboriously. It was properly done in terms of the modeling, in terms of the validation. Unfortunately, there were things in the world that the model just couldn't pick up because it was based on correlations, because it hadn't observed that variability in the past. So for example, I think, yes, so the CDC numbers of the flu, here there was a second wave of the flu that Google flu trends completely missed in 2009. Later on, the creators went back, they recalibrated it, it did well, but then there was another season where it completely overestimated the amount of flu. And a paper from David Lazar and colleagues called The Parable of Google Flu Trends theorizes that it was half winter detector, half flu detector, because it picked up on non-causal, sometimes we call those spurious correlations between winter search terms and flu. It wasn't able to shift when there was something different in the world that no longer matched that. And I will return to this example as well. Another example that Juliana asked is why, after all of this knowledge about correlations and causations, about measurement, does the world keep moving more and more to being committed to correlations? I think one thing is certainly that machine learning has some impressive successes. And there is really good work, I think, now in the history of science about the histories of artificial intelligence. I recommend an article from Matthew Jones, How We Became Instrumentalists Again, Data Positivism After World War II, about how machine learning filled a need, especially in the military and also businesses, to take these large databases that they had and do something with it. Does that thing work? Is it meaningful? Is it accurate? Well, by the time you've made a decision on it, maybe you don't even have time to test it properly. In statistics, data mining for a long time was a kind of insult that, oh, this is just data mining. When in fact, data mining filled a very big need for businesses, which was to take these massive databases and do something with them. And another reason or another really great example I like to bring up, this is from Dan Bouck's book, Creditworthy. There was a Black legislator in the 19th century in Massachusetts. He was born into slavery, and then after the end or after emancipation, moved to Massachusetts, worked as a janitor, but also served as a state legislator. He introduced a bill to ban an insurance company practice of charging Black people more. There was a local lawyer who critiqued this bill, saying that, well, if you just look at the numbers, the death rate for quote unquote colored people is much higher than the death rate for whites. So it's not discrimination, it's just a matter of business, right? It's not motivated by bad will or anything bad. And in fact, if you exclude this practice, you're probably going to cause terrible, economic collapse. You'll cut Black people off completely from being able to access insurance. This argument in 1870, or I don't forget, but maybe it was a little bit later, was rejected. And his allies noted that these statistics, these empirical realities that this lawyer was bringing up, were asking the wrong question. It wasn't about who's a poor insurance risk, but about the potential for equality. And the idea being that if you offer Black people insurance rates that are worse than white people, you're further entrenching this inequality. You are constraining the potential for equality. This was a fight that in the 1800s was won, but as people like Kaylee Horan, historian, one of my colleagues, Rodrigo Ochagame, and others are picking up, was sort of refought and lost in the 1970s around actuarial fairness, where insurance companies said, if it predicts, it's fair, and they won that argument. And that's become more and more entrenched in the world. And I think we can indeed preference the central mass over outliers, over minority groups, and that will probably make more money. It will probably lead to more optimal outcomes as defined quantitatively. But of course, the consequences of that are much harder to quantify, much harder to see if you're only looking at statistics and numbers. And that's maybe why we still move more and more towards a hope in positivism, this hope that what is measurable will give us everything, is everything that we care about and need. And so that's something that I think, whether it's in the use of machine learning or even just in the expansion of what are used to make credit scores or insurance rates, we need to think critically about and be willing to reject and not accept this argument that, oh, it's just the empirical reality. Oh, it's just optimal. It's just fair. It's just efficient. When in fact, these notions of fairness and even efficiency are made on the basis of a very specific set of values that we maybe should reject. Going back to Google Flu Trends, I mentioned that the model was constructed properly. One important thing about machine learning is that it only has past data on which to validate. A typical way of doing that, since it's no longer guided by theory, is it will hold out a portion of data. If you have a time series, you should do this in temporal blocks, which they did correctly. Use a first portion of data to do your curve fitting, and then test on the remaining portion of data and see how well you would have done if indeed this had been new data. In my paper, I talk about all the ways that this can break down. And one of these ways, as Google Flu Trends showed, is if there is unexpected variability in the world. If there's some underlying causal process that has only acted one way up until now, but now acts another way and will completely throw off your machine learning performance. There's an example that I like to give. A paper was originally published in 2002 that found about 70 genes that correlate with developing breast cancer. And of course, they did the machine learning properly, so this is very optimal when holding out a certain portion of data. Specifically, they used leave one out cross-validation, training on the other set, testing on this held out thing. But does it actually generalize to the world? It was only in 2016 that, and this again showing the branch, instead of going down this branch, or rather k-fold, leave one out is an example of k-fold cross-validation, another paper went down this other branch of doing true out-of-sample testing in an experiment. This is published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2016. There, they compared a traditional diagnosis versus the diagnosis given by the machine learning system. And if the machine learning system said the risk was high, the clinical risk was high, people were put into chemotherapy, no question. Similarly, if both tests showed low risk, people were not put into chemotherapy. The question was, when they disagree, when the clinical risk is low, but the gene expression risk is high, what do you do? And same with the other side. The doctor says to treat and the model says don't. You have this question about these two squares of the box. So they did an experiment. People falling into these two boxes were randomized into chemotherapy and not chemotherapy. And what they found is for people in this box, chemotherapy actually led to worse outcomes. In this box, chemotherapy led to similar outcomes. And since it's a very painful and long process, if it doesn't affect your outcomes, you preference not giving people chemotherapy. And so that was able to then give a sort of decision criteria about how to use the machine learning system. Machine learning alone would have made things worse. So if you just use this row of using the things that were high. But now with this experiment, we can see there's a secondary diagnosis. It can catch false positives and avoid unhelpful chemotherapy, but only as a secondary diagnosis. And this, we don't understand what in these 70 gene expressions is causing breast cancer. The initial experiment was only done with, I think, 64 people, or maybe certainly less than 200 people, which is not a very good sample size. So we'd want to repeat this with a larger, more representative sample. This test also was only done in Europe, across several countries, but still it wasn't global. So there are lots of ways in which the sample was not representative. All the same concerns still apply around sampling. But this is a good approach of doing experimental testing of a machine learning system as a whole to see how it interacts with the world. And I want to then conclude about imagining the future of machine learning in social research. And an example, actually, Juliana brought up an article by Buckingham Shum that gives two examples. One is the Open University in the UK. They had this project, Open University Analytics, and a similar project in Georgia State University. And I would say before accepting the claims that a machine learning system works, that predictive analytics work, we should have real world and holistic testing. And that might be, for example, in Georgia State University, all the money that was spent on this analytics platform, what if that had been put into additional teachers as well, additional guidance counselors and human support? And one big thing that critics point out is that Georgia State University, along with this predictive system about who was going to drop out, who was going to fail, also hired a lot of new guidance counselors. So was the causal impact really just the guidance counselors? What if you had spent the money just on more of that instead? So there's a lot of things happening that are hard to tease apart. One thing I like about the Open University Analytics project is that they in fact did a qualitative assessment. And I think ultimately that might be the best way to judge these predictive systems, is not to do experiments, not to measure how well they do, but to do qualitative research and see how they impact people's, in this case, learning and teaching and interventions. And as I talk about in my paper, as other literature talks about, experiments have endless contingency as well. It's really hard to definitively say that an experiment does or does not generalize, does or does not give us what we want to know. And that's even if the results are, significant. do the results from the UK transfer over to the US? Do the results from a university serving primarily first-generation students generalize to a really prestigious university serving mostly, elite students? So there are all these questions, and there's something called experimenter's regress, that you can always challenge every little bit in an experiment that you never quite know. You have to have a whole set of theories about what's valid, what works, that are completely before the quantification process. For labeling, I think I give some examples from Desmond Patton in my paper about the importance of bringing in domain knowledge, of doing qualitative coding for machine learning annotation or labeling, developing a code book saying what should we classify as what category when the human labelers are doing it, before putting those human labels into a machine that can, into a model that can try to scale them up. And I think rejecting new and even existing forms of governance via correlations. And that will also mean thinking hard about what's a better alternative. One good thing about metrics is that they can level the playing field, whereas personal discretion is, a recipe for authoritarianism, for discrimination, for further entrenching elites. But metrics can do the same things if gaming the system is the best way to win, and people with the resources know how to game the system. But we should think about alternatives to fairly distributing research resources rather than citation-based indices and metrics. We should think about how we can have ways of assessing students in an institutionalized, standardized way that aren't grades. And that's going to be a very hard process. And in some cases, metrics might be the least bad solution, but they are not ever the only solution. And as long as we rely on them, as long as we further entrench them, whether that's with machine learning or with statistics or just heuristics, we're going to run into the same problems again and again. And thank you for your time.